You are about to cross into a world where fear is real. Real stories, unexplained phenomena where the supernatural lurks in the shadows. From the portal of dread.
Have you ever wondered what happens when we close our eyes at night? If we're truly alone in that moment of vulnerability between consciousness and sleep? If that feeling of being watched in the shadows of your room is just a product of your imagination or something more? Welcome to the portal of fear. Here, your fears gain a voice, and each story could be your last before you turn off the light. If this is your first time here, subscribe and activate the bell, because some stories simply won't let you sleep. What I'm about to recount happened in the fall of 2017 in a small town in the interior of Minas Gerais. The names have been changed to protect the identity of those involved, but the facts are real, documented, and inexplicable. This is the story of Carolina Mendes, a 27-year-old woman who was seeking to restart her life after the end of a tumultuous relationship. She needed a place of her own, far from the memories of the 5 years she had shared with Andre, her ex-fiancé. A small apartment would be ideal, but the prices in the city where she lived were beyond her budget. That's when, browsing through the local newspaper's classifieds, she came across an ad that seemed too good to be true. House 43 Jasmine Street, 3 bedrooms, large living room, renovated kitchen, rent 40% below market value, preference for people who live alone. Contact Immobiliaria Silva. The price was almost impossible for a house of that size. Carolina knew that something was off. Maybe the place was too far away, or it was in poor condition. Nevertheless, she decided to check it out. She had nothing to lose except a few minutes of her time. The next morning, Carolina met with Mr. Antonio, a man of approximately 70 years, owner of Immobiliaria Silva. There was something strange in his eyes when she mentioned her interest in House 43. A fleeting hesitation, almost imperceptible. The house has been vacant for 8 months, he explained, avoiding eye contact as he rummaged through some papers on the desk. It's an excellent opportunity, but I need to be honest with you, miss. Carolina felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Antonio cleared his throat before continuing. The last tenant, well, she died on the property. It was a suicide. They found her in the master bedroom. Most people are uncomfortable with that kind of thing, which is why the rent is discounted. The silence hung heavy between them for a few seconds. Carolina gulped hard. Her first impulse was to thank him and leave, but the reality of her salary as an administrative assistant imposed itself. She needed a place to live, and fast. How long has it been? About 2 years. Mrs. Helena lived there for decades. She was a very reserved woman, almost never left the house. After her death, we completely renovated the property. New floors, paint, even the plumbing was replaced. Carolina tried to calculate mentally. The low rent meant she could save up to buy her own property in the future. Besides, she wasn't superstitious. Deaths happened every day, everywhere. Can I see the house today? Mr. Antonio's face seemed to relax a bit. Of course. I can take you there right now if you're available. Jasmine Street was in a quiet residential neighborhood with old houses built between the 1940s and 1970s. House 43 stood out for its lordly aspect, a colonial-style building with a front porch supported by columns, high windows, and a small garden surrounded by a low stone wall. As they approached, Carolina noticed that despite the conservative style, the facade was immaculate, with recent paint in beige tones and white details. The garden, although simple, was well maintained. We hired a gardener who comes every 2 weeks, Mr. Antonio explained, as if reading her thoughts. It's included in the rent. He rummaged through a set of keys until he found the correct one, an old heavy metal key with ornate details. Carolina found it curious that despite the mentioned renovation, they hadn't changed the locks. As he opened the door, they were greeted by a spacious and bright environment. The living room had a dark wood floor that contrasted with the light walls. An ornamental fireplace occupied one of the walls, and large windows allowed generous natural light to enter. As you can see, everything is in perfect condition, Mr. Antonio said, leading her through the property. The kitchen has been completely modernized. Carolina observed everything with growing interest. The kitchen was spacious with new cabinets and a granite countertop. The 3 bedrooms were large, each with a small closet. The master bedroom, where Helena was supposed to have taken her own life, was the most beautiful. Facing east, it received morning light through generous windows. What was the room where it happened? Carolina asked, trying to sound casual. Sue Antonio hesitated again. This very one, the master bedroom. But as I said, everything has been renovated. New flooring, new paint. Nothing remains from that time. Carolina nodded, trying to ignore the momentary discomfort. For some reason, her eyes were drawn to the ceiling of the room. A simple chandelier hung from the center, swaying slightly. There were no open windows, no breeze that could justify that movement. "Are you interested in renting?" Sue Antonio asked, interrupting her thoughts. The rent price came back to her mind, dispelling any hesitation. "Yes, I am. When can I move in?" 3 days later, Carolina arrived with 2 suitcases and a few boxes containing her belongings. The rest of her furniture would be delivered during the week, but now she would sleep on an inflatable mattress she had bought especially for this transition. The feeling of owning her own space was indescribable. Carolina walked through the empty rooms, imagining how she would organize each area. In the master bedroom, which she had decided to transform into her bedroom despite the dark history, she planned to put a comfortable bed facing the window so she could wake up to the morning sun. The first hours in the house were peaceful. Carolina cleaned a few corners she thought necessary, organized her personal items in the bathroom, and prepared a sandwich for dinner. When night fell, she inflated her mattress in the master bedroom and got ready for bed. It was only when all the lights were turned off that she felt for the first time that unsettling sensation of not being alone. Lying in the dark, Carolina watched the shadows that the faint moonlight projected through the thin curtains. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that everything was fine, something seemed off. The silence was too oppressive, complete, as if the entire house was holding its breath. At 3:17 in the morning, a time that would be etched in her memory, Carolina woke up with a start. She hadn't had a nightmare, nor had she heard a specific noise. It was more like a sensation, an instinctive knowledge that something had changed in her surroundings. The air was icy cold, not the natural chill of the early morning hours, but a localized cold, as if she were immersed in a bubble of Arctic air. Her breath condensed in front of her, forming small white clouds that slowly dissipated. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, Carolina noticed something. A shadow denser than the others, a patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the little available light. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, a trick of her sleepy mind. But then the shadow moved, not like a person moves, with steps or gestures, but like smoke writhes in the air, a fluid, almost hypnotic movement. Carolina froze. Every fiber of her body screamed for her to run, but fear paralyzed her completely. The shadow remained in the corner for several seconds, as if observing her. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it dissipated. The warmth gradually returned to the room. Carolina remained still for almost an hour, her eyes fixed on the spot where she had seen the shadow, until the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate through the window. When she finally found the courage to get up, her legs were trembling. It was just a nightmare, she murmured to herself, although she knew she was fully awake. During breakfast, she tried to rationalize what had happened. Stress from the moving process, a vivid imagination fueled by the story of the old tenant, or perhaps a combination of both. She decided not to dwell on the episode. That same morning, the delivery men brought her bed, a sofa, a dining table, and some other essential furniture. The house was starting to take on a personality. Carolina felt safer with the furnished house. Empty spaces always seem more prone to harboring shadows and distorted imaginations. The second night was peaceful. Exhausted after a day of organizing the house, Carolina fell into a deep sleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. No shadows, no supernatural cold. It was on the third night that things began to change definitively. Carolina had just settled into bed with a book in her hands when she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound, the sound of fingernails scratching wood. It came from inside the closet. Her body stiffened instantly. The sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate. slow scratches, as if someone or something was on the other side of the wooden door, tracing patterns with long, sharp claws. "Is someone there?" Her voice came out weaker than she intended, tremulous and uncertain. The scratching ceased immediately. The silence that followed was almost worse than the previous noise. Carolina remained paralyzed for several minutes, her eyes fixed on the closet door, gathering courage to investigate. Finally, with her heart pounding against her chest, she got up and walked slowly to the closet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. With a quick motion, she opened the door. Nothing. Only her clothes hung orderly. Not a rat, not an insect. Nothing that could explain the sound she had heard so clearly. She was about to close the door, convincing herself that she had imagined everything, when she noticed something strange at the back of the closet. On the wooden wall that formed the back of the wardrobe, there were marks. Thin, precise lines forming a pattern she couldn't quite distinguish in the dim light. Carolina extended her hand to touch the marks and recoiled immediately. They weren't old. The wood was slightly damp around the scratches, as if they had been made seconds before. That was the first time Carolina seriously considered the possibility that she wasn't alone in House 43. The next morning, Carolina got up after a restless night. Her body ached as if she had run a marathon during sleep. There were dark bags under her eyes, and an inexplicable fatigue dominated her muscles. As she prepared her coffee, she tried to convince herself that it was all just coincidences and imagination. "Old houses make strange noises," she murmured to herself, watching the dark liquid fill her cup. The wood expands and contracts with temperature changes, but deep in her mind, the scratch marks in the closet remained as disturbing evidence. Damp marks, too recent to be explained by time or chance. That day, Carolina decided to investigate more about the house's history. During her lunch break, she visited the municipal library. The town was small enough that local news from years ago was still relevant, especially those involving unusual deaths. The librarian, a grey-haired woman with perceptive eyes, helped her locate old editions of the local newspaper. Carolina avoided mentioning the specific address she was looking for, saying only that she was researching the history of the neighborhood she had moved into. It was between the yellowed pages of a 2-year-old edition that she found what she was looking for. A small note, almost hidden among classified ads and mundane news. Elderly woman found dead in residence. Helena Vasconcelos, 76, was found unresponsive in her home on Rua dos Jasmines. According to police sources, the apparent cause of death was suicide by hanging. Ms. Vasconcelos had lived alone for over 3 decades, and as reported by neighbors, rarely left her house in recent years. There is no suspicion of foul play. The news was dry, impersonal. No mention of grieving family or funeral services. It was as if Helena Vasconcelos had simply vanished from the world without leaving a mark, except for that tiny newspaper note. Carolina photographed the page with her cell phone and continued searching. Later that week, she found another small mention of the death. Neighbors report strange behavior from elderly woman before suicide. Residents of Rua dos Jasmines report that Helena Vasconcelos, found dead in her home last week, exhibited erratic behavior in the days leading up to her death. She would scream at night, as if arguing with someone, but she lived alone, said a neighbor who preferred to remain anonymous. The police ruled out the possibility of homicide after analyzing the scene. A chill ran down Carolina's spine. Helena would scream at night, as if arguing with someone, but she lived alone, just like her now. More intrigued than frightened, Carolina decided to look for more information about the former resident. She typed Helena Vasconcelos's full name into her cell phone search engine, but the results were sparse and irrelevant. That's when she had an idea. "Excuse me?" She approached the librarian again. At 3:17 in the morning, a time that would become etched in her memory, Carolina woke up with a start. She hadn't had a nightmare, nor had she heard a specific noise. It was more like a sensation, an instinctive awareness that something had changed in her surroundings. The air was icy, not the natural chill of the early morning hours, but a localized cold, as if she were immersed in a bubble of Arctic air. Her breath condensed in front of her, forming small white clouds that slowly dissipated. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, Carolina perceived something, a shadow denser than the others, a patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the little available light. For a moment she thought she was imagining things, a trick of her drowsy mind. But then the shadow moved, not like a person moves, with steps or gestures, but like smoke curls in the air, a fluid, almost hypnotic movement. Carolina froze. Every fiber of her body screamed for her to run, but fear paralyzed her completely. The shadow remained in the corner for several seconds, as if observing her. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it dissipated. The warmth returned to the room gradually. Carolina remained still for almost an hour, her eyes fixed on the spot where she had seen the shadow, until the first rays of sunlight began to seep through the window. When she finally found the courage to get up, her legs trembled. It was just a nightmare, she murmured to herself, although she knew she was wide awake. During breakfast, she tried to rationalize what had happened. Stress from the moving process, a vivid imagination fueled by the story of the former tenant, or perhaps a combination of both. She decided not to give the episode any importance. That same morning, the delivery men brought her bed, a sofa, a dining table, and a few other essential pieces of furniture. The house was starting to take on a personality. Carolina felt safer with the house furnished. Empty spaces always seem more prone to harboring shadows and distorted imaginations. The second night was quiet. Exhausted after a day of organizing the house, Carolina fell into a deep sleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. No shadows, no supernatural cold. It was on the third night that things began to change definitively. Carolina had just settled into bed with a book in her hands when she heard it, a soft, almost inaudible sound. The sound of nails scratching wood. It came from inside the closet. Her body stiffened instantly. The sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Slow scratches, as if someone, or something, was on the other side of the wooden door, tracing patterns with long, sharp nails. Is someone there? Her voice came out weaker than intended, trembling and uncertain. The scratches ceased immediately. The silence that followed was almost worse than the previous noise. Carolina remained paralyzed for several minutes, her eyes fixed on the closet door, gathering courage to investigate. Finally, with her heart pounding against her chest, she got up and slowly walked to the closet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. With a quick movement, she opened the door. Nothing. Just her clothes hung neatly. Not a rat, not an insect. Nothing that could explain the sound she had heard so clearly. She was about to close the door, convincing herself that she had imagined everything, when she noticed something strange at the back of the closet. On the wooden wall that formed the back of the closet, there were marks, thin, precise lines, forming a pattern that she couldn't quite distinguish in the dim light. Carolina extended her hand to touch the marks and recoiled immediately. They weren't old. The wood was slightly damp around the scratches, as if they had been made just seconds before. That was the first time Carolina seriously considered the possibility that she might not be alone in House 43. The next morning, Carolina got up after a restless night. Her body ached as if she had run a marathon during sleep. There were dark circles under her eyes, and an inexplicable fatigue dominated her muscles. As she prepared her coffee, she tried to convince herself that it was all just coincidences and imagination. Old houses make strange noises, she murmured to herself, watching the dark liquid fill her cup. The wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. But deep in her mind, the scratch marks on the closet remained as disturbing evidence. Damp marks too recent to be explained by time or chance. That day, Carolina decided to investigate more about the house's history. During her lunch break, she visited the municipal library. The town was small enough that local news from years ago was still relevant, especially those involving unusual deaths. The librarian, a grey-haired woman with perceptive eyes, helped her locate old editions of the local newspaper. Carolina avoided mentioning the specific address she was looking for, saying only that she was researching the history of the neighborhood she had moved into. It was between the yellowed pages of a 2-year-old edition that she found what she was looking for. A small note, almost hidden among classified ads and mundane news. Elderly woman found dead in residence. Helena Vasconcelos, 76, was found lifeless in her home on Rua dos Yasmins. According to police sources, the apparent cause of death was suicide by hanging. Ms. Vasconcelos had lived alone for over 3 decades and, according to neighbor reports, rarely left her house in recent years. There is no suspicion of crime. The news was dry, impersonal. No mention of grieving family members or funeral services. It was as if Helena Vasconcelos had simply disappeared from the world without leaving a mark, except for that tiny newspaper note. Carolina photographed the page with her cell phone and continued searching. In the same week, she found another small mention of the death. Neighbors report strange behavior of elderly woman before suicide. Residents of Rua dos Yasmins report that Helena Vasconcelos, found dead in her home last week, exhibited erratic behavior in the days leading up to her death. She would scream at night, as if arguing with someone, but she lived alone, said a neighbor who preferred not to be identified. The police ruled out the possibility of homicide after analyzing the scene. A chill ran down Carolina's spine. Helena would scream at night as if arguing with someone, but she lived alone, just like her now. More intrigued than frightened, Carolina decided to look for more information about the former resident. She typed Helena Vasconcelos's full name into her cell phone search engine, but the results were sparse and irrelevant. That's when she had an idea. "Excuse me?" She approached the librarian again. "The lady has been working here for a long time." The woman smiled. "Almost 30 years, dear. Do you happen to know a lady named Helena Vasconcelos? She used to live on Jasmine Street." The librarian's smile gradually faded away. Her eyes, once welcoming, became cautious. "Why are you asking about Helena?" Carolina hesitated. "I just moved into the house where she used to live. I'm curious about the history of the place." The librarian looked around, as if checking to see if they were alone, and lowered her voice. "Helena was my friend for many years. We were close in our youth, but she changed after she married Augusto. She became reclusive and anxious. After his death, she got even worse." "She hung herself, didn't she?" Carolina asked, feeling her heart accelerate. The librarian frowned. "That's the official version, yes. But Helena had severe arthritis in her hands. She could barely hold a cup without feeling pain. How could she have tied a knot strong enough?" She shook her head. "I never believed that suicide story. What do you think happened then?" The woman sighed deeply. "Helena called me the night before her death. She was terrified. She said she had come back, that she wouldn't leave her alone. I thought it was just mental confusion, maybe early dementia. Helena always feared ending up like her mother, who died without recognizing her own children." The librarian paused. "Now I wonder if I should have gone over there that night." "She, who?" Carolina felt her mouth dry out. Who had come back? Helena never mentioned a name, but in the last months of her life, she often talked about a presence in the house. Someone who was watching her, who would move her things around when she wasn't looking. I thought it was just delusions." Carolina felt her legs weaken. She had to lean on the table to avoid losing her balance. "Are you okay, dear? You look pale." "I'm fine," Carolina lied. "Just a bit tired." "Thank you for the information." As she left the library, Carolina felt like she was carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. Helena Vasconcelos's story was disturbingly similar to the strange events she had started to experience. The feeling of being watched, the unexplained noises, the supernatural chill. She decided that when she got home from work, she would research more about the history of 43rd House. If Helena wasn't the first to sense a strange presence there, perhaps there were records of prior occurrences. When Carolina arrived home that afternoon, something had changed. She perceived it as soon as she stepped onto the porch. The atmosphere was different, heavier, as if the house was aware of her investigation and wasn't pleased. Upon opening the door, she was greeted by a strange odor, an antique, sweet, and suffocating perfume mixed with something reminiscent of decomposing flowers. The smell was concentrated mainly in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Carolina walked through the house, checking if any windows had been opened or if there was a rational explanation for the sudden aroma. Everything was exactly as she had left it that morning. The last stop was her bedroom, where the smell seemed to emanate with greater intensity. The closet, the odor was definitely coming from there. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Upon opening the door, the perfume became almost unbearable. Carolina covered her nose with her blouse sleeve and examined the interior of the closet. Her clothes were as she had left them, but something had changed on the wooden floor. The scratches she had seen the previous night had multiplied, now forming more complex patterns, almost like letters. Carolina leaned in, narrowing her eyes to try to decipher what seemed to be a message etched into the wood. My house. The words were too clear to be accidental, too precise to be the result of chance. Someone, or something, had left a message for her. Carolina recoiled, bumping her back against the opposite wall. Her heart was pounding against her chest with such force that it hurt. For a moment, she considered grabbing her essentials and running away, but a part of her, perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, refused to be expelled so easily. "This is my house now," she said aloud, surprising herself with the firmness of her own words. "I pay the rent. I have a signed contract." Only silence responded. The smell of antique perfume began to dissipate slowly. That night, Carolina had 2 scheduled meetings. The first with Mr. Antonio from the real estate agency, whom she called demanding more information about the house's history. The second, although unplanned, would be with the entity that had left its mark on the closet. Mr. Antonio reluctantly agreed to meet her at a cafe in the city center. When he arrived, he seemed nervous, constantly adjusting his tie and avoiding direct eye contact. "Miss Carolina, I understand your concern, but I assure you that everything you needed to know about the property was communicated before the contract was signed." His words sounded rehearsed, mechanical. "You mentioned the suicide of Helena Vasconcelos, yes, but you didn't mention that you believed the house was haunted, that you felt a presence pursuing her." Carolina leaned over the table. "And you also didn't mention that there are doubts about how she really died." Mr. Antonio visibly paled. "They're just rumors, miss. This small town thrives on gossip. Helena was an elderly lady with mental health problems. The police investigated and confirmed the suicide. And before her, who lived in house 43? The man hesitated. "The house has belonged to the Vasconcelos family for generations. Helena was the last one. And all the Vasconcelos died there. That's it." "Not all of them," he replied, looking away. "Augusto, Helena's husband, passed away in the hospital after a long battle with cancer. Their daughter Elisa moved abroad when she was young. She never came back, not even for her mother's funeral." "Elisa," Carolina repeated the name, feeling a chill run down her spine. "She's still alive." "I believe so, but we don't keep in touch. The house was put up for rent, following the instructions of the family's lawyer. Elisa explicitly didn't want to know anything related to the property." Carolina reflected on this information. Why would the daughter so vehemently refuse to have any connection to the house where she grew up? There have been other incidents in the house, other deaths besides Helena. Mr. Antonio sighed deeply. "Look, Miss Carolina, if you're dissatisfied with the property, we can cancel the contract. I'll return your deposit in full." The proposal was tempting, especially after the strange events. But Carolina had invested time and money in the move. Moreover, a part of her, the same part that had driven her to face the presence in the closet, wanted to uncover the truth about House 43. "I don't want to cancel the contract. I just want to know exactly where I'm living." "Nothing more than what has already been said happened in that house," he insisted, but his tone was not convincing. "It's just an old building with the typical history of a traditional family from the countryside. Nothing more." Carolina knew he was lying, but she also realized she wouldn't get any more information out of Mr. Antonio. She thanked him for his time and left the cafe, determined to uncover the secrets of House 43 on her own. The sky was darkening when she opened the front door. The interior was silent, but not the normal silence of the late afternoon. It was a conscious, vigilant silence, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for her arrival. Carolina headed straight to the master bedroom. If there was going to be a confrontation, it would be on her terms, while she still had the courage fueled by her frustration with the conversation with Mr. Antonio. The room was exactly as she had left it, but the closet door, which she was certain she had closed before leaving, was slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness between the door and the frame seemed to mock her earlier bravado. "I'm tired of these games," she said out loud, approaching with firm steps. "If you have something to say it directly." Carolina opened the closet door with a sudden movement. The scratched letters on the wood had changed. Where it had previously read, "My house," now it read, "She lied." Carolina's heart racing. The message seemed freshly made, with wood shavings still fallen on the closet floor. "Who lied?" she asked the empty air. "Helena." "About what?" No answer came, but the air around her cooled drastically. The same localized cold she had felt on her first night in the house. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her. Suddenly, the old, suffocating perfume returned, more intense than before. It was too sweet, nauseating, like a bouquet of flowers left too long in stagnant water. Carolina felt nausea rising up her throat. And then she saw, not a shadow this time, but a defined shape. In the full-length mirror fixed on the wall opposite the closet, a reflection that was not hers. An elderly woman, with grey hair tied back in a severe bun, wearing a formal antique dress. Her eyes, deeply sunken into their orbits, fixed on Carolina with a disturbing intensity. Carolina spun around abruptly, but there was no one behind her. When she glanced back at the mirror, the image of the elderly woman was still there, watching her. Her thin lips moved slowly, forming soundless words. With a stifled scream, Carolina ran out of the room, stumbling in the dark corridor, bumping her shoulder against the wall. But she didn't stop until she reached the front door. Her hands were trembling so much that she could barely turn the doorknob. Once on the porch, breathing in the night air in large gulps, Carolina realized she had nowhere to go. Her life was there now. Her belongings, her new beginning. Everything was inside that house. She sat down on the porch steps, trying to calm herself down. Maybe she was having hallucinations. Stress, fatigue, and the stories about Helena could be affecting her mind. Or maybe, just maybe, House 43 really did harbor something beyond the physical world. When she finally gathered the courage to return, the house was silent. The perfume had disappeared, as had the supernatural chill. Still trembling, Carolina went straight to the kitchen, avoiding looking down the corridor that led to the bedroom. She prepared a cup of tea, and after a few sips, she felt calmer. That's when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello, Mrs. Carolina Mendez." A female, elderly voice sounded from the other end. "Yes, who's speaking?" "My name is Maria Lucia. I was a friend of Helena Vasconcelos. The librarian told me about your visit today. We need to talk about House 43. Carolina felt a chill run down her spine. "Something strange happened here today. I saw something." "Don't talk about it on the phone," the woman interrupted, her voice filled with urgency. "The walls have ears, especially in this house. We can meet tomorrow. It's important." "Yes, of course." Carolina jotted down the address the woman provided, a house on the other side of town. "And Carolina," the woman's voice dropped to almost a whisper, "don't sleep in the master bedroom tonight, please." The call ended before Carolina could ask why. She looked down the dark corridor that led to the bedroom, feeling fear grow in her chest again. She decided to follow the advice. She grabbed a blanket and settled into the living room sofa, leaving all the lights on. Even so, sleep took a long time to come, and when it finally did, it was filled with nightmares. In her dream, Carolina was trapped in a room without windows. The walls seemed to be breathing. A dark, viscous liquid dripped from the ceiling. In the center of the room, an elderly woman, the same one she had seen in the mirror, swayed gently, suspended by a rope attached to the chandelier. Her feet, mere centimeters from the floor, moved as if searching for support. And then, in an impossible movement, the woman's head spun 180 degrees, facing Carolina. Her eyes were empty, just black orbits. Her mouth opened far more than humanly possible, and from within it emerged a different face, younger, furious. "She lied," said the young face in a whisper-amplified voice. "And now you'll pay." Carolina woke up screaming, her heart pounding as if it wanted to escape her chest. She was drenched in cold sweat. and her hands clutched the blanket with such force that her knuckles were white. The room was just as she had left it, lights on, TV in standby mode emitting a blue glow. Everything was normal, except for one detail. The scent of old perfume lingered in the air, and on the wall opposite the sofa, visible even in the brightness of the room's lamps, new scratches formed words that froze her blood. Helena no longer lives here. Part 3. Carolina didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She remained seated on the sofa, her eyes fixed on the scratched message on the wall, until the first rays of sunlight began to seep through the curtains. Only when natural light filled the room did she feel safe enough to get up and make coffee. Her hands still trembled as she held the cup. All her bravado from the previous night had vanished. If she could, she would pack her things and leave the house at that very moment, contract and deposit be damned. But something held her back. Not just the financial reality, but a growing need to understand what was happening. Helena no longer lives here, she murmured, repeating the message on the wall. What did it mean? That another entity now occupied the house? Or was it Helena herself trying to communicate, referring to herself in the third person? Carolina checked the clock. It was still 7:15 in the morning. Her meeting with Maria Lucia, Helena's friend, was not scheduled until 2 p.m., and she had long hours of waiting ahead of her. She decided not to stay at home during that period, so she grabbed her bag, keys and cell phone and hastily left without even taking a shower or changing clothes. On the street, the fresh morning air helped to clear her thoughts. She walked aimlessly for a few minutes until she saw an open bakery. The establishment was practically empty at that hour. Carolina ordered a strong coffee and cheese bread and sat down at a distant table. While waiting for her order, she opened her cell phone's browser and typed House 43 Jasmine Street history. The results were scarce, but one link caught her attention, a blog about local history that mentioned the city's traditional families, including the Vasconcelos. The article described how Augusto Vasconcelos, the family patriarch in the 1950s, had built a considerable fortune in local commerce. House 43 had been built by him as a wedding gift for his young wife, Iolanda. The couple had only one daughter, Helena. Helena, Carolina whispered. The same Helena who had died in the house 2 years ago. This meant that she had spent virtually her entire life in that residence. Continuing to read, Carolina discovered that Augusto had passed away in 1975, leaving all his assets to his wife and daughter. Iolanda, however, did not enjoy her inheritance for long. She died just 3 years later, in circumstances described as mysterious by the blog. The death of Iolanda Vasconcelos remains one of the great local mysteries, the text said. Found in the basement of House 43 with signs of violence on her neck. It was initially suspected to be a robbery followed by homicide. However, nothing was stolen, and the only person present in the house was her daughter Helena, then 26 years old, who claimed to have heard noises and found her mother already lifeless. Carolina felt a chill. Helena had found her mother dead, with signs of violence in circumstances similar to those in which she herself would be found decades later. The article continued, mentioning that Helena had married a university professor named Ricardo shortly after, and had a daughter, Elisa. The family had lived together in House 43 until the early 1990s, when Elisa, then a teenager, had abruptly left for abroad after a serious family disagreement that was not specified. Ricardo passed away from cancer just a few years later, leaving Helena alone in the house for the last 25 years of her life. The coffee arrived, but Carolina barely noticed it. Her mind was racing with questions. What could have been the grave disagreement that led Elisa to abandon not only the house, but the country as well? And why did she refuse to have any contact with the property even after her mother's death? More importantly, who or what was currently in House 43, communicating through scratches on the wood? The hours dragged by slowly. Carolina visited a bookstore, a shopping mall, anywhere that would keep her away from home. Finally, at 2 p.m. sharp, she was standing in front of Maria Lucia's residence, a modest but well-maintained house in a quiet neighborhood. A lady of around 80 years with completely white hair and an upright posture despite her age greeted her at the door. "Carolina," she asked, examining her with perceptive eyes behind old-fashioned glasses. "Please come in." I've been waiting anxiously for you. The interior of the house was cozy, with antique but comfortable furniture and numerous framed photographs on the walls. Maria Lucia led her to a small living room and offered tea, which Carolina gratefully accepted. Helena was my friend for over 60 years, the elderly woman began, after serving the tea in delicate porcelain cups. We grew up together, attended the same school. I was present on the day she met Ricardo at their wedding, at Elisa's birth. She paused, her eyes lost in distant memories. And I was also with her during the difficult times. Many difficult times. Do you think she really committed suicide? Carolina got straight to the point. Maria Lucia sighed deeply. Helena suffered from severe depression in her last years. The loneliness, the absence of her daughter, the memories, everything weighed on her. But suicide? She shook her head. Helena was a devout Catholic. She considered taking one's own life the worst of sins. So what happened? The elderly woman adjusted her glasses, as if she were taking time to organize her thoughts. To understand what happened to Helena, you need to know the story of her mother Iolanda. And to understand Iolanda, she hesitated. Well, everything starts with the house. Carolina felt a shiver run down her spine. House 43. Maria Lucia nodded gravely. Augusto Vasconcelos didn't build that house from scratch, you know. He renovated a construction that was much older, one that had existed on that land since colonial times. It was said that the place had been a stopping house for travelers in the 19th century. Many people had entered that place over the years, and not everyone had left. The house is haunted then. Carolina attempted to maintain skepticism in her voice, despite her own recent experiences. It's not that simple, the elderly woman replied. Helena believed there was something in the house, something that first manifested itself to her mother, and then to her. A presence that could influence thoughts, provoke visions, and even temporarily take control. She lowered her voice. Control, like possession. Possession, you mean, Carolina said. Let's call it that, although Helena never used that word. She said it was like sharing her body with another consciousness. Moments when she saw herself doing or saying things without wanting to, like being trapped inside herself, watching another entity use her body. Carolina felt her mouth dry up. And you believe this? She said. Maria Lucia held the cup with both hands, as if seeking warmth. I've known Helena all my life, and she wasn't one for fantasies or exaggerations. If she said something controlled her occasionally, well, I tended to believe her. What happened to Iolanda, her mother? I read that she was found dead in the basement. The elderly woman nodded. It was terrible, apparently strangled. The police initially suspected Helena, since she was alone in the house with her mother, but there was no conclusive evidence, and the case was eventually closed as a break-in by an unknown person. And Helena, what did she say about it? That's the most disturbing part, Maria Lucia said, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. Helena said she didn't remember what happened that night, had flashes of memory, her own hands extended, her mother's purple face, but insisted it wasn't her controlling her actions. There was something inside her. Carolina felt a chill run down her entire body. And Elisa, Helena's daughter, why did she leave home so abruptly? The elderly woman's face hardened. This is the saddest chapter in the story. Elisa and Helena had a difficult relationship during the girl's adolescence. Constant fights, inexplicable behavior from both parties. One night when Elisa was 17, there was an incident. What kind of incident? Elisa woke up with her hands clutching her throat. When she managed to turn on the light, she saw it was Helena. But Helena looked different. Empty expression, unfocused eyes. Elisa managed to push her away and flee the room. The next day, Helena had no memory of the incident. My God, Carolina murmured. Elisa left the house that same week. She never came back. She would send occasional letters, later emails, but she refused to visit. Even when Ricardo fell ill, even at his funeral, even when Helena grew old and was left alone, the fear was greater than any other feeling. Carolina tried to absorb everything. But what exactly is in the house? A ghost? A demon? Maria Lucia shook her head. Helena had a theory. She believed the entity was not an individual spirit, but a kind of echo, an emotional record of past traumas. accumulated over decades or centuries, like a recording that repeats, but can be amplified or distorted by the emotions of the inhabitants. An echo of trauma, Carolina repeated thoughtfully, that manifests through the living. Exactly. And the more emotionally vulnerable a person is, the more susceptible they become to its influence. Carolina then remembered what had brought her to House 43, her own recent trauma, the painful end of a long relationship. Was this making her more vulnerable? In the last months of her life, Maria Lucia continued, Helena would call me almost daily. She would say she had returned stronger than ever. She always referred to the entity in the feminine form. She who? Carolina asked, remembering her conversation with the librarian. Helena never used a specific name, but sometimes she would mutter things like the other one or the tenant. She would say she felt like a visitor in her own home, as if she shared the space with someone who had been there long before and would remain long after. The elderly woman paused. The last time we spoke, Helena said something I've never forgotten. When we die in that house, we don't really leave. We just change form. Carolina felt a knot in her throat. And do you think she was... that the entity forced Helena to hang herself? Yes, that's what I believe. Or worse still, that it took complete control of her body to do it. Maria Lucia set the cup down with trembling hands. And now you're there, Carolina. Alone. Just like Helena was. For a few moments, the only sound in the room was the ticking of an old clock. Carolina was trying to process everything she had heard, connecting it to her own experiences at House 43. What should I do? She asked finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. Leave that house, Maria Lucia replied without hesitation. Today, if possible. Don't spend another night there. But my contract, my things. None of that is worth your mental sanity or your life. The elderly woman leaned forward, holding Carolina's hands between hers. Helena was my dearest friend, and I couldn't save her. Maybe I can help you. Carolina promised to seriously consider the immediate move. She thanked Maria Lucia for the information and said her goodbyes, her head buzzing with everything she had discovered. On the walk back, she made a decision. She wouldn't flee cowardly. She would return to the house, pack some essential belongings, and look for a hotel to spend the night. In the morning, she would talk to Mr. Antonio about cancelling the contract. She would leave, yes, but on her own terms. The afternoon was already turning into dusk when she arrived at Jasmine Street. House 43 stood out against the orange sky, its dark windows like eyes watching her approach. As she put the key in the lock, Carolina noticed something different. The door, always a bit stubborn, opened with unusual ease. Maybe it hadn't been completely closed. The interior was plunged into twilight. Carolina extended her hand to the switch near the entrance, but nothing happened when she flipped it. She tried again, without success. Great, she muttered. Power outage. Using her cell phone's flashlight, she advanced down the corridor towards the bedroom. Her plan was simple. Grab clothes for a few days, hygiene products, important documents, and leave as quickly as possible. The trembling beam of light partially illuminated the path. The shadows seemed denser than usual, moving strangely at the edges of her vision. Carolina quickened her pace. As she entered the main bedroom, she felt it immediately. The old, suffocating perfume, more intense than ever. And the cold, a freezing cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Her breath formed dense clouds in front of her. I'm just going to grab my things and leave, she said out loud, both to herself and to any presence that might be there. I don't intend to stay. She headed to the closet and began to hastily pull out clothes, throwing them onto the bed. As she did this, she couldn't help but glance at the back of the closet. The scratches were still there, but they had changed again. Now they formed a single word. Stay. Carolina drew back, dropping a few pieces of clothing. I won't stay, she replied, surprising herself with her own courage. This isn't my home. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, although no window was open. The curtains billowed like sailboat sails, and the bedroom door slammed shut with a loud crash. Carolina rushed to it and tried to open it, but the doorknob wouldn't turn. Let me out, she shouted, pounding on the wood. Please. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the distant hum of traffic or the wind in the trees penetrated that sonic vacuum. It was as if the entire house had been insulated from the outside world. And then, a voice, a low, raspy whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "You're like her." Carolina spun around, searching for the source of the sound. The beam of light from her cell phone illuminated only the empty room. "Like who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Helena, fragile, afraid, easy." A movement caught her attention. In the full-length mirror, a silhouette began to take shape. It wasn't the elderly woman she had seen before, but a younger figure with long, dark hair. "Who are you?" Carolina asked, her heart pounding so hard it seemed about to explode. The figure in the mirror drew closer to the glass, as if it might cross over at any moment. Her face became visible, a woman of about 30 years old, with features that vaguely resembled Helena's, but were harder, colder. "She didn't tell you about me," the apparition said, her voice now clearer. "No one tells." "Elisa," Carolina ventured, recalling Helena's daughter. "You're Elisa." A cruel smile formed on the woman's lips in the mirror. Elisa fled, abandoned her mother, abandoned the house, didn't have the courage to face the truth. What truth? That some bonds can't be broken by distance. The figure tilted her head, studying Carolina with morbid curiosity. "Like the ones holding you now." Carolina looked around, confused. That's when she noticed dark, almost invisible threads in the dim light, extended from the walls to her wrists, ankles, and neck. They weren't physical threads, but they seemed so real she could feel the pressure on her skin. "What is this?" she asked, trying to free herself from the ethereal restraints. "What do you want from me?" "I want what I've always wanted," the woman replied. "A place, a body, a life." Suddenly, Carolina understood. The tenant of House 43 wasn't Helena. It was this entity, this consciousness that had occupied the place for generations, manifesting itself through the women who lived there. Iolanda, Helena, and now it was trying to reach her. You made Helena kill her own mother," Carolina said, the pieces falling into place in her mind. "And then you tried to do the same with Elisa." The woman's smile in the mirror widened. "Smart, smarter than Helena. She never accepted what she had done, even when I showed her the memories. She preferred to believe in ghosts, possessions, anything except the truth, that the evil was already inside her, like it's inside all of you." Carolina felt the invisible threads tighten. "You're not real. You're just a psychological manifestation, an echo, as Maria Lucia said." The woman's expression hardened. Maria Lucia, always meddling where she's not invited, talking about what she doesn't understand. "She understands enough," Carolina retorted. "Enough to warn me about you. And what good is the warning if you're here now? If you can feel my presence seeping into your mind?" The figure drew closer to the glass. "You think you're strong, that you can resist." Helena thought so too at first. They all do. Carolina closed her eyes, trying to block out that hypnotic voice. When she reopened them, the figure had disappeared from the mirror. In its place, she saw only her own reflection. But there was something different in her eyes, something cold and calculating that she didn't recognize. A terrible thought crossed her mind. What if there was no entity at all? What if House 43 simply amplified the darkest aspects of those who lived there? A catalyst for violent impulses that already existed but were normally repressed. "You're understanding now," the voice whispered, now seeming to come from inside her own head. "I'm not an invader. I'm just a mirror of what already exists within you." Carolina felt an inexplicable wave of anger growing in her chest. Anger at Andre, who had abandoned her, anger at Mr. Antonio, who had lied about the house, and anger at Helena for being weak. The emotion was so intense, so overwhelming, that for a moment she almost completely surrendered to it. It was then that she saw, reflected in the mirror, her own hands moving without her conscious command, slowly rising towards her neck. "No," she screamed, regaining control with a supreme effort. "You're not going to control me." Her hands stopped just centimeters from her throat, trembling with the conflict of wills that was taking place within her. "They all say that," the voice responded, now almost bored. In the end, they all give in. Carolina retreated to the opposite wall, as far as possible from the mirror, and closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing as she tried to calm the whirlwind of negative emotions that threatened to engulf her. "You're not real," she repeated like a mantra. "You only have the power that I give you." A cold laugh echoed through the room. "Ask Helena about that." "Oh, wait, you can't. She's dead." The mention of Helena awakened something in Carolina, not anger this time, but determination. Helena had spent decades in that house, fighting against that influence, and if she had ultimately succumbed, it was after a long battle. Carolina could learn from that. "Helena may be dead," she said firmly, "but I'm not, and I'm not going to end up like her." "They all say that too," the voice sneered. Carolina ignored the provocation. Her cell phone still worked, partially illuminating the environment. With deliberately slow movements, she approached the door and tried the doorknob again. To her surprise, it turned easily. A trap, possibly, but staying in the room was certainly not an option. The corridor was completely dark. Carolina advanced slowly, guided only by the faint light of her cell phone. The shadows seemed to move around her, following her, watching her. "You can't escape from me," the voice said, now seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. "This house is mine, and you're mine now." "I am not anyone's property," Carolina responded, continuing to move forward. "Especially not something that only exists because I allow it to exist." Upon entering the room, she noticed that the front door was closed. She tried to open it, but it was locked. Not with a key, but as if something was holding it sealed from the other side. "See, there's no way out." Carolina ignored the voice and headed to the kitchen. The windows there were larger. Perhaps there was a way to escape through one of them. However, upon entering the room, she stopped abruptly. Seated at the kitchen table, illuminated only by the faint moonlight that entered through the window, was a familiar figure, the elderly woman she had seen in the mirror earlier, Helena Vasconcelos. But there was something wrong with her appearance. Her neck was bent at an impossible angle, and dark marks surrounded her throat. Her eyes, fixed on Carolina, were bloodshot. "She's lying," Helena said, her voice a hoarse whisper that seemed forced through a crushed throat. "It's not a reflection of you. It's something older, deeper." The other voice, the entity's, rose in fury. "Silence." "What should I do?" Carolina asked, surprising herself by dialoguing with an apparition. "Go to the basement," Helena replied. "See for yourself." "There's nothing in the basement," the other voice shouted. "Just dust and darkness." Carolina then realized the entity was afraid. There was something in the basement that it didn't want Carolina to discover. Helena's apparition pointed to a small, discreet door near the pantry, a door that Carolina hadn't even noticed in her previous visits to the kitchen. "Quickly," Helena whispered. Before she regains her strength, Carolina didn't hesitate. She ran to the door and opened it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. With only her cell phone light to guide her, she began to descend the old wooden steps, which creaked under her weight. The basement was a large, low-ceilinged space with an arched brick ceiling and a dirt floor. Piles of old boxes occupied the corners, covered in decades of dust. The air reeked of mold and something else, a metallic odor reminiscent of blood. "There's nothing for you here." The entity's voice was now laced with panic. Carolina ignored it, advancing with determination. The light from her cell phone illuminated a specific spot on the dirt floor, where the soil seemed to have been disturbed recently. Guided by an impulse she didn't fully comprehend, Carolina knelt down and began to dig with her bare hands. The earth was loose, easy to remove. Within minutes, her fingers touched something hard. Wood. She continued to excavate around it, revealing what appeared to be a small box or chest. With effort, she managed to extract it from the soil. It was an old, dark wooden box with oxidized metal clasps. It wasn't locked. "Don't open it!" The voice was now almost pleading. "Please!" Carolina opened it anyway. Inside, she found bones. Small, fragile bones. The remains of a child. Alongside the mortal remains, there was an old locket with a black and white photograph. A girl, approximately 10 years old, with serious eyes and dark hair tied in braids. She wore Victorian-style clothing, suggesting the image dated back to the late 19th century. On the back of the locket, a name was engraved in delicate letters: Elisabete, 1889-1899. Understanding struck Carolina like a bolt of lightning. The entity wasn't just a psychological echo or a reflection of repressed impulses. It was the spirit of a child, dead for over a century, secretly buried in the basement of the house that would eventually become House 43. Elisabete, Carolina whispered. An inhuman scream echoed throughout the structure of the house. The ground trembled and dust fell from the basement ceiling. The cell phone light flickered and went out completely, plunging Carolina into absolute darkness. But in the next instant, all the lights in the house came on simultaneously. The power had returned, or perhaps it had never really been absent. Carolina slowly stood up, still holding the locket. The silence that followed was profound, but different from the previous silence. This wasn't oppressive or threatening. It was just peace. Elisabete, she repeated, looking at the girl's photograph. What happened to you? As if in response, images flooded her mind, not as a forced invasion, but as voluntarily shared memories. She saw a girl running through fields that would one day become the residential neighborhood. She saw the old boarding house, with travelers arriving and departing. She saw a man, the father, drunk and violent. A discord, an accident. No, a murder. And then, a secret burial in the basement. The anger of a child unjustly killed. A soul trapped for over a century at the site of their death. A presence that, over the decades, had forgotten its own origin, becoming only pure anger, a desire for revenge, a need for control. Carolina slowly ascended the stairs, still clutching the locket. The house seemed different now, lighter, less oppressive. In the kitchen, there was no sign of Helena's apparition or any other supernatural presence. In the days that followed, Carolina did not experience any more strange phenomena in House 43. No mysterious scratches, no supernatural chill, no feeling of being watched. She hired a specialized team to perform a proper burial of the mortal remains found in the basement. A small ceremony was held, attended by Maria Lucia and a few other longtime residents of the town. Carolina could have left the house after these events. Mr. Antonio was more than willing to cancel the contract without penalties when she revealed her macabre discovery. But something made her stay. Perhaps it was the feeling that House 43 had finally found peace. Or perhaps it was the connection she felt with the women who had lived there before, Yolanda, Helena, and even little Elisabete. 6 months after her move, Carolina received an unexpected letter. The sender, Elisa Vasconcelos. Somehow Helena's daughter had found out about the recent events and had decided to make contact. For decades, I believed my mother was the monster. The phrase from the letter echoed in Carolina's mind as her eyes scanned the final lines of the yellowed paper. Her hands trembled, not just because of the revealing content, but because something else was happening. The air around her seemed dense, charged with static electricity. Elisabete's locket, which Carolina now kept with her at all times, suddenly warmed against her chest. The temperature in House 43 plummeted in a matter of seconds, forming condensation clouds with each breath. "No," Carolina whispered, recognizing the signs. "It's over. We freed you." A faint, almost inaudible childlike laughter slithered through the corridors like smoke. The lights flickered frantically before going out completely. In the absolute darkness, Carolina felt it. She was not alone. "You really believed," a childlike voice whispered directly into her ear, "that a simple burial could set me free." Carolina spun around, but found only emptiness. The locket now seared against her skin like incandescent metal. "Elisabete, why? We gave you a dignified burial." A sharp laughter cut through the air. "Those bones," the voice sounded closer, "were not mine." A chill ran down Carolina's spine. The final words of Elisa's letter suddenly made terrible sense. "Beware of what you have unleashed. It is not who you think it is." The locket erupted in blue flames that did not burn, illuminating the room with a ghostly clarity. In the mirror before her, Carolina saw not her own reflection, but that of the girl from the locket, Elisabete. However, her childish face was contorted in an expression that no child should be capable of making. "You were a perfect tenant," Elisabete whispered, her reflection approaching the glass. "So determined to find answers, so willing to unearth secrets, so easy to deceive." Understanding hit Carolina like a physical blow. "The bones were bait." Elisabete smiled, her small pointed teeth visible in the reflection. "Generations of women in this house all believing they could exorcise me, bury me, pacify me." The girl's voice aged as she spoke, becoming the same adult woman's voice that Carolina had heard before. "Helena was the only one who understood in the end. That's why I had to silence her." The air around Carolina thickened until it became almost unbreathable. Her limbs felt heavy as lead, and an inexplicable pressure began to constrict her throat. "What do you want?" Carolina forced the words through the invisible grip. "What I have always wanted," the entity replied, now using Helena's voice. "A vessel, a body, a life." Carolina's eyes caught a movement in the mirror. No longer Elisabete or Helena, but an undefinable shadow older than the house, older than the land itself. Something that only used human names as temporary masks. "You're not Elisabete," Carolina managed to say, fighting against the pressure in her throat. "You never were." "Names are irrelevant," the entity replied. "I am House 43. I am the soil beneath it. I am the hunger that is never satiated." Carolina felt her body move against her will, her hands rising towards her own neck. She struggled with all her might, but her fingers drew closer inexorably. "Now," the entity whispered, "you will be me, and I will be you." The grip on her throat intensified. Black dots danced in her vision. Carolina knew she was seconds away from losing consciousness. That was when she felt it. A different presence. Not malignant, not cold, but protective. Beside her, almost imperceptible in the gloom, stood Helena. Not the deformed and broken Helena she had seen before, but Helena as she would have been in life. Strong, determined, her eyes full of compassion. "You're not alone," Helena whispered. "We never were." Behind Helena, other silhouettes took shape. Iolanda, unknown women from past times, all victims of House 43. All now united. "It's not the house that has power," Helena continued, her voice gaining strength. "It's us. It's always been us." Carolina understood. The entity was not the house possessing its inhabitants. It was the opposite. Fragments of consciousness from the women who died there, distorted by anger and fear, trapped in a perpetual cycle. "Together," Carolina murmured. The hands around her throat loosened. The medallion on her chest shone with blinding intensity, and the silhouettes of the women converged on Carolina, filling her not with cold or terror, but with strength, with memory, with collective determination. "No," the entity's voice was pure panic now. "They're mine. None of us is yours," Carolina replied, her voice now a symphony of all the women. "The house is ours." The supernatural pressure imploded like a bursting bubble. The lights returned, but different. Not the artificial electric light, but a golden luminosity that emanated from the walls themselves, from the air itself. Carolina fell to her knees, panting, exhausted. Elisabete's medallion had disintegrated, leaving only a reddened mark on her skin. When she finally found the strength to stand up, something had fundamentally changed in House 43. The air was light. The shadows were just shadows, and the silence was the natural silence of an old house, not the oppressive absence of sound she had felt before. In the following weeks, Carolina remained in the house, working on the rooms one by one, cleaning, renovating and opening windows that had remained closed for decades. In each room she momentarily felt the presence of the former occupants, not as frightening ghosts, but as welcoming memories. Eventually, Elisa Vasconcelos accepted her invitation to visit. Helena's daughter, now a grey-haired lady, hesitantly stepped into the house she had sworn never to enter again. "It's different," Elisa murmured, touching the walls with her trembling fingers. "I feel her. I feel all of them, but at peace." Carolina smiled. They were never the monster, nor were we. Together, Carolina and Elisa transformed House 43 into a home for women in vulnerable situations. victims of violence, homeless people, single mothers without support. The place that had imprisoned women in cycles of pain for generations now served as a refuge, a point of rebirth. At night, Carolina still felt occasional presences, a gentle touch on her shoulder, a familiar perfume in the air, the distant sound of female voices conversing. But she was no longer afraid. House 43 had been transformed, just like its history. In her diary, Carolina wrote, "We are all temporary tenants of this existence. The true horror is not in ghosts or supernatural entities. It's in allowing the cycle of trauma to continue indefinitely, passing from generation to generation like a cursed inheritance. House 43 taught me that we only break this cycle when we face our collective darkness, when we transform our fear into shared strength." And then on the last page, with handwriting that didn't seem entirely hers, the final words, "Helena no longer lives here. Elisabete no longer lives here. The darkness no longer lives here. Only us, finally free. If you've made it this far, your courage deserves recognition." This story is just a glimpse into the psychological horrors we explore on our channel. Every week, new narratives are unearthed from the depths of the human mind, ready to invade your dreams and alter your perception of reality. Subscribe now and activate the bell. Each notification may be the only warning you'll have before the next nightmare begins. Leave a like if you felt that shiver down your spine, that feeling of being watched while watching. The comments are your only refuge to process what you've just experienced. And until the next episode, if you have the courage to come back,